Okay, welcome everybody. Let me check my mic, make sure my mic is working. I just want to do an absolute verification since last time the mic didn't record. Okay, welcome everybody. Let me check so for some strange reason, I just checking the audio. For some strange reason, last time my mic did not record the audio at all, and I'm going to delete those videos and I'm going to redo this. It took me about an hour. Hopefully I can do it quicker this time. So first things first, we're going to look at the crypto market as I always do when we come into the episode. If I want to talk specifically about crypto related things in the episode, I will. This time we're just going to check into the market. I want to show you a couple things about my profitability on my mining. And then we're going to get into how beer will save the world. So I'm going to prove to you, or I will show you exactly how beer will save the world. Last time we looked at crypto was yesterday. The price was 8,500. So we're up a little bit. Earlier today when I did the earlier episode with no audio, it was 8,500. So 544 I think it was. So we're pretty much right where we were before. Likewise, if we look at the volume, market volume, what's going on, we got Bitcoin, we got Tether is almost the equivalent volume. If you look at the size of the block, it's, I don't know, what is that, 2/3 at least? It's more than 2/3, maybe 3/4 of what Bitcoin is. Ethereum is pretty healthy today as far as volume. And Litecoin, I don't remember seeing Litecoin this big, but looks like there might be a fair amount of activity with Litecoin. It's plus 2.2%, whereas if you look at the others, they're pretty much even. I see everything pretty even-ish, sort of, right? I don't see any big movers or shakers in the market, except for it looks like Litecoin has some movement, and it looks like it has a fair amount of volume associated with this uptrend of 2.27. So with that said, let's look at my favorite beam that I've been mining. Now I want to give you an update on something. Earlier today, I shut my rigs down. Yeah, it was about here. I was looking at my hash rates, and I thought, well, let me take a look at some things. So I went in and I shut my rigs down quickly, and I clocked them. I overclocked them a little bit differently, tweaked a few little settings here and there. And ever since I did that, this one should be running about 180-ish, like it should have been normally, and this is about 120-ish. So with that said, if we look at the average now, we're at 329 versus earlier we were at, if I come back here, you see I touched, this morning I touched here, it was at 300. So it's been picked up ever since I reassigned the or shut down the mining software and then restarted it. Now I tweaked, like I said, I tweaked a little bit. We're really taking in a lot of beam right now, and if I copy this, let me see, copy. I just did this a few minutes ago. 7318, 7318. So if I come to my mining ROI, let me switch over to Excel. Yeah, I got to move this up so I can see what I'm doing. There we go. I think that's the same number, isn't it? Yeah. 73, what was it? 73 what? 18. So if I come in here, 7318. You see, so yesterday and this morning, I shut it down this morning, and it was like one of the worst days possible, right? And that's why I went in there, I tweaked with it, and I restarted the miners. So I had a really, really bad day yesterday. Now, I have a third of a day done, and it's one of the best days. So 572, 531 as far as coins coming in, right? That's the important thing to me. 525, 572, 531. So it's the second best day. And then dollar-wise, income per day, it's the best, well, it's second best income per day as well. So I don't know if shutting it down and restarting it did something, but I'm going to keep an eye on that as far as what the trends show, right? So we'll keep an eye whether I need to shut it down occasionally and restart it. Does that make a difference or not? And we'll go from there. So back to this concept of how beer is going to save the world is yesterday I did a video and I talked about how you brew beer, which, let me take another sip again. Let me make sure my audio is going still again. Because, yeah, okay, so now the audio is working fine and I didn't change anything. It's so strange. Whatever. So yesterday I covered how you brew beer, and I talked about all grain brewing, you do a mash, you do a lauter, you do a sparge. You take all your liquid, you heat it up, you boil it, you got to then cool it down and put it into the fermenter. And fermentation and kegging, conditioning, and carbonation. And you can do some conditioning in the fermenter as well. We talked about the beer Borghini and the beer Borghini Junior and how I designed these things. And that video was broken up. I don't know I really don't know what's going up on with OBS and YouTube and Restream, and we'll figure that out though. Anyway, I went through the design, how I designed these things, and as I was talking about it, I literally came up on the idea about, as I was describing it, when I said I fermented, that CO2 is released when you ferment the beer, and CO2 is the new Brando, right? So plants love Brando. So I did a little something I want to share real quick as pertaining to Brando, okay? And then we'll move forward.
He would not get out of the way. This time, he would lead.
For the last time, I'm pretty sure what's killing the crops is this Brando stuff.
The Brando's got what plants crave. It's got electrolytes.
So wait a minute. What you're saying is that you want us to put water on the crops?
Yes.
Water? Like out the toilet?
Well, I mean, it doesn't have to be out of the toilet, but yeah, that's the idea.
But Brando's got what plants crave.
It's got electrolytes.
Okay, look. The plants aren't growing, so I'm pretty sure that the Brando's not working. Now, I'm no botanist, but I do know that if you put water on plants, they grow.
Well, I've never seen no plants grow out of no toilet.
Hey, that's good. You sure you ain't the smartest guy in the world?
Yeah.
So let's go back.
Okay, look, you want to solve this problem. I want to get my pardon, so why don't we just try it, okay? And not worry about what plants crave.
Brando's got what plants crave.
Yeah, it's got electrolytes.
What are electrolytes? Do you even know?
It's what they use to make Brando.
Yeah, but why did they use them to make Brando?
Because Brando's got electrolytes.
Okay, so plants like Brando, right? Because it has electrolytes. So in reality, plants like CO2, which is the new Brando, okay? And what cracks me up about, we won't go down that path, but what cracks me up about CO2 is plants really like Brando, okay? So, I mean CO2. So when I say that, let's close that up. Cancel now. We'll just ignore that for now. But when I say that, let me copy a link here real quick, and we will share it. No, it's none of those. Oh, it's over here. Forgive me for one quick second. I have to get to my information. Okay. And you should say, oh, you should have prepared more. Yes, I should have. Oh, well. So here we go. So after yesterday's episode, I started researching CO2 and plant growth, okay? And I had read some articles, and I shared one of them yesterday, as far as plant growth and carbon dioxide. And what we found was that plant growth and carbon dioxide for maximum yield. So there was this, I found this article, and it's a very detailed article as well, but it goes through, it talks about the ideal level for CO2 supplementation is 1,500 parts per million. And I struggled a little bit with parts per million, but I'll show you what I've done. I got it perfectly solved now. But it talks about that plants really thrive or flourish under very high levels of CO2, like 1,500 to 2,000 ppm. But then you need to run warmer temperatures and you need extra lighting and blah, blah, blah. So this is a very, very rigorous and detailed article, but it goes through and it talks about CO2 and CO2's impact on plant growth. Okay, and it goes through and it gives examples, and you can, I'll provide the link. You also see the link in the video, so you can go there yourself if you want. So from that information, and knowing that we are, when we brew, we're emitting CO2 from our fermentation process, right? What I did is I took this graph from yesterday. I created an equation on the red line. You see there's 65, 75, 85% attenuation. I said, well, let's take the midpoint. So I equationed, I set up data points so I could build an equation around the red line. And based on that, and then on the bottom, you got the specific gravity of the beer you're brewing. So on the left side, you're brewing light beers, very low grain beers. And then on the right side, you're brewing very heavy stouts with a lot of fermentable materials in it. And it shows how much cubic feet of carbon dioxide you're releasing with each one of those, with the different specific gravities, right? So my question that I set up for myself was, how much CO2 can I create from brewing beer? And what would be the right amount? Because, if you don't do any brewing, you got 0 additional CO2. And if you brewed a billion gallons, you're going to have, some incredible amount of CO2 you're creating, right? So there's a whole range in between. And I wondered to myself, for my greenhouse or for any greenhouse, could I create a calculator that would show me how much CO2 I'm adding to the system, right? So what I did is I created this calculator, and what I realized from the calculations is after doing a bunch of scenarios, greenhouses should have between 49 and 50 microgallons of beer per day per gallon of greenhouse brewed inside of them. So let's examine how we can analytically prove this. So you start off with the calculator by specifying the geometry of your greenhouse. So my greenhouse, I set this up so you could do flat or near flat. You could do both sides curved, so it goes from the ground on one side curved and to the ground on the other side, kind of like a Quonset hut. And then the third type I considered for my calculator was you might want a half curve, so it goes from the ground up to, let's say, a center point vertically, right? So those are the 3 types of greenhouses I said. Now, my greenhouse that I'm considering, and I'll go through mine first so we can look at all the variable changes, right? And the green fields are what you can change. But my greenhouse I'm considering is going to be 10 feet high. It'll be 40 feet long, plus or minus, a few feet. And then the width should be about 9 feet is what I'm allocating for the geometry of my greenhouse, okay? And I'll zoom in a little bit more so we can get a little better view on this. So then I calculate the total volume in the greenhouse. Now this total volume in the greenhouse, you can see up in the formula bar here, it's a function of the geometry. So if you come in here and you change, see it's 3600. If you change to both sides curved, it recalculates it. It says, oh, with both sides curved with the same geometry, it's 3303. And with a half curved, if you want to think about it, is a quarter of a circle. It's 2835. Okay? So I'll put that back to flat or near flat. So that's specifying the geometry of your greenhouse. And then here, as another reference, the volume is 26,900 gallons. I round that up to the hundreds place, just for convenience. So 26,900 gallons is what the greenhouse can hold roughly. Now, I went out to the internet. I looked up the current atmospheric CO2 level. It's approximately 410 parts per million at this point, which is a volume of 1.48 cubic feet of CO2 in the greenhouse. So of the 3,600 cubic feet that the greenhouse contains, 1.5, we'll call it, of those cubic feet is actual CO2. The rest of it is oxygen and nitrogen and argon and, the rest of the gases that make up our breathable air, right? So if you break that cubic feet down into inches, it roughly means that a box with equal sides would be 13.7 inches. So just a little bit over a foot would be the size of the box that would contain the CO2 inside of this greenhouse, okay? Now, as I mentioned, if you change the geometry, obviously the amount of CO2 changes because the volume changes, et cetera, and you can see the size of the box changes, right? Likewise, if you change the height, let's say we go to 20, you'll see all the numbers update as well. It's all formula-based, okay? And if there's interest, I can convert this calculator into metric if you want, but you could also do just conversions in metric. But I can make this calculator available on Google Docs If people want it, put it in the comments. I'll make it available on Google Docs if you want. So we got the geometry of the greenhouse. We have the CO2 in the atmosphere. Now, the next step is how much does brewing, if I put the CO2 from brewing inside of the greenhouse, how much would that add to the CO2 inside of the greenhouse, right? So that's the next portion that I had to tackle. So what I said is, like my last batch I brewed 5 gallons of beer, and I'm going to approximate its specific gravity was 1.055, so it's kind of a average ale, if you will. And the third parameter that you can specify down here is the active fermentation time. So how long does the CO2 actually actively ferment this batch? And it was about 5 days. It took 7 days total, but when I say active, I mean like bubbling and active and, you know, a good amount of CO2 being emitted. It's kind of a normal probability distribution, so it's a bell curve kind of but that time span of, let's say, rigorous fermentation was about 5 days. So if you do the calculations from this, and then using this equation here that I developed, and you'll see it down here, here's the equation that was developed to curve fit that line up there, is 14.66 cubic feet of gas will be generated from fermentation, okay? So that's the amount of gas. And this is how beer is going to save the world. Beer will save the world through this mechanism. Because brewing this beer it causes an overall increase of 1,093% in the CO2 concentration, okay? So it's a huge increase in the CO2 concentration. And if we put that into the greenhouse with an overall greenhouse equivalent concentration of, and what I did here is I took the CO2 from the atmosphere plus the CO2 generated from the beer, and I put it to a parts per million. It comes out to an equivalent of 1,224 parts per million during each day of fermentation. So I broke that CO2 generation over the 5 days of fermentation, and it comes out that the greenhouse would have an equivalent concentration of 1,224. Which, if all other growing needs of the plants are provided for, should approximately increase your greenhouse vegetable yields by 31%. And this is how beer will save the world. As food becomes more and more important, as the population of the earth grows, food will become more and more important, and increasing the yields of our vegetables is going to become more important. So CO2 supplementation of greenhouses, and what I'm going to be doing is what we'll call suburban or urban aquaculture, but I'm doing CryptoPonics. So it's aquaponics combined with cryptocurrencies, and there's some advantages that we really haven't talked about there yet, but so combining them will have an advantage, but brewing beer inside the greenhouse or putting the CO2 that's generated inside of the greenhouse will have a significant impact on the yield of the plants that you're growing inside of there, okay? Now, this information is not my information. It's information from articles that are public, and I found multiple articles that agree with this statement, okay? So from this information, what I did is I said to myself, well, what's the ratio? So in conclusion, I came up with a parameter called microgallons of beer per day per gallon of greenhouse, right? And you see currently I have 37.17 microgallons of beer per day per gallon of greenhouse. Now, the graph at the top that you saw was from this Life Fermented WordPress. That's the link to it right there. The article that I was referencing on the web, here's the link to that article, okay? And so then I said to myself, the article, if you read the article, so I set the calculator up, and what the calculator shows, if you brew beer, now if you increase your specific gravity, if I go to 1.07 specific gravity, it increases the parts per million of CO2 because there's more fermentable, you generate more CO2, right? So if I make a stout, 1.11, you could see the CO2 concentration goes above 2,000 parts per million. Okay. Now the article that I reference, it talked about the optimal is 1,500 parts per million, and then it talked about going up to 2,000 parts per million. Okay. So let me go this way. 1.1 will go. So that I'm under 2,000. Above 2,000, I'm not really sure what happens. Nobody talks about it. Okay. So if I had concentrations above 2,000 parts per million, I'm not sure. Do you kill the plants at 2,500? Do you kill? I don't know, right? So if we do 5 gallons of beer and I pump all the CO2 in there at 1.1 specific gravity of the beer over 5 days, it's going to generate, this much CO2, 1887 parts per million. Now, the article that I reference from this Jason's Indoor Guide, he basically says anything above 1,500 parts per million, you need to provide, knowing that 70 to 80 watts of additional supplemental lighting will be required, as well as increasing the temperature of the greenhouse by 15 degrees with this brew quantity. So what I'm referencing here is that as you increase the CO2 input into the greenhouse, at some point when the concentration gets high enough, for the plants to fully utilize all that CO2, you have to increase the lighting that the plants receive, as well as increasing the temperature of the greenhouse so that it can, the atoms are moving faster, they bump into the leaves faster, and the uptake of CO2 is faster, right? So this is all, it's so incredibly complex, but that's how life is, right? So I'm going to put this back to 1.055, and what I'm going to do now is I'm going to do what I call a goal seek, Alt-TG, Alt-Tom Giraffe. I don't know the military versions because I wasn't in the Army. But what I want to say is set this cell to 1,500 by changing the batch size. So how much beer would I have to brew in order to get 1,500 parts per million in the greenhouse, right? Because he says that's the optimal point. So 6.69 gallons of beer, if I brew a batch of 6.69, it's going to release the right amount of CO2 into the greenhouse to make 1,500 parts per million of CO2 in the greenhouse. And by releasing that amount, I'm going to get a 36% increase in vegetable yields. Plant yields. The plant yield will increase by 36%, right? So that's pretty phenomenal, right? And you see down here the design parameter, 49.76 microgallons of beer per day per gallon of greenhouse. And that's why up here I say greenhouse should have between 49 and 50 microgallons, okay? And the reason I say between 49 and 50, you'll see this number stays constant. Watch. So if I change my greenhouse size, which I played with this a lot, so let's say my greenhouse isn't 10 feet tall, let's say it's 8 feet tall, right? And let's say the length is 20 feet long and the width of it is, let's say, 12 feet wide, right? And instead of being a flat greenhouse, it's a both sides curved, so it's like a Quonset hut, okay? So that greenhouse would have a calculated volume of 1,539 cubic feet. That's less than half of what my previous greenhouse was. And based on this information, you will see, I'm going to goal seek again, watch, Alt-TG, set that to 1,500 was the optimal design value by changing the gallons of beer, right? So with this greenhouse, it's a much smaller greenhouse. Like I said, it was about half the size of the greenhouse, right? Less than half. You can see I should be brewing 2.86 gallons of beer batch. That should be my batch size to release this much CO2 to increase the parts per million to 1,500. And I'm going to get the same 36% yield and the design parameter 49.77, right? We'll do one more like this real quick, but we'll do a very large greenhouse now. So let's just say we got a 40-foot warehouse. It's 4 stories tall, 10 foot per story, 4 stories tall. I have this massive greenhouse, and the length is going to be 120 feet, and the width will be 80 feet wide, okay? So I just have this massive greenhouse. It's 301 cubic feet of volume. And with that basis, 410 ppm is still the atmospheric level of CO2. We will goal seek. You see, the brewing 2.86 gallons of beer in this giant warehouse greenhouse, it doesn't do anything to the ppm, right? But if I do a goal seek and I say set that to the same design optimum of I want 1,500 parts per million by changing the batch size of what I'm brewing. So with this tremendously huge building, 4-story building that's 120 feet by 80 feet, I would be brewing 560 gallon batches of beer to generate enough CO2, which is a fair amount of beer. You're going to be bottling and selling beer at that point, right? Or you're going to be kegging the beer, whatever you're going to be doing with it, right? That's quite a bit of beer. I say that's quite a bit of beer. That's over, let's say, a 7-day or 5-day period, right? So that's 100 gallons per day. So it's really not that much, actually. But what you'll see is I end up at the same 1,500 parts per million, 36% vegetable yield, and 49.7 is my design parameter. Microgallons of beer per day per gallon of greenhouse. So what I noticed when I was doing this, I noticed that this ratio, this parameter was consistent no matter what I kind of did with the greenhouse size. And then by setting the parts per million to 1,500, I get the same yield and I get the same, design parameter, right? Now, if you say, like for me, I'm going to put my parameters, my height is 10 feet, my length is 40 feet, and my width, I said, was 9 feet. That's going to be mine. Oh, that one I did was both sides curved, fair enough, but whatever. So this describes my greenhouse, and I'm going to goal seek that again. Now you see, if I brew 560 gallons of beer, it's going to do 91,726 parts per million of CO2. I have no idea what that would do. Now, let me. One of the things I'm considering is, as you brew beer, let's argue I brew 25 gallons of beer, okay? Because that's how big my beer Bergini can do. We looked at that yesterday. So I'll be able to make batches of beer, 25 gallons of beer at a time. If I did that, if I brewed 25 gallons of beer, what would happen is I would be substantially over the 2,000 parts per million of CO2, right? But my question is, in my greenhouse, wherever I emit this CO2, now, but anyway, let's say I vent the CO2 into one place in the greenhouse, right? Now, as the CO2 spreads throughout the greenhouse, the plants are going to consume it potentially. I'm not exactly positive about that because this might be a high enough level it kills the plants. I haven't read anything like what becomes toxic to plants, when is there too much CO2, when isn't there enough CO2. And one of the things I'm thinking about doing with my greenhouse is, let me switch real quick to the web, is I want to put, well, let me go to the drawing real quick because I'll do that real quick. So what I'm thinking about doing from the drawing perspective, let me go to kind of a new area here, is, can I change one of these? Yes, I can. Okay. So what I plan on doing with my greenhouse, or what I want to do for science and for education and for, all of that, right? This isn't to scale, but imagine it is, right? What I want to do is I want to put a CO2 sensor, let's say here. No, not like that. I want to put a CO2 sensor there. I want to put one here approximately. And I want to put one here, and then one here, and one here. So let's say I'm putting the CO2. I'm going to draw X real quick. Let's say I'm putting the CO2 into the greenhouse at that location, right? Right here, we'll say, right? Let's say that's where I can pipe the CO2 into the greenhouse, and I have plants all throughout the greenhouse. Now, what I want to do is something like, come on, really? I want to do something like this here. Okay, so if I'm emitting the CO2 at this location, let's say the X marks the spot where the CO2 is being emitted. I want to take measurements using Raspberry Pi or like Arduino Megas or Arduino Unos, something that ultimately I want to log this into a blockchain so that it's traceable and it's part of the data. We'll talk about that a little bit later too. But I want to measure CO2 at these locations that the circles are at, right? And see what happens as the CO2 comes out, how much is consumed by the plants at what distance, right? Because as the CO2, and then you got to look at how much ventilation you have in here and stuff like that, right? But as the CO2 comes out, the plants are going to be consuming, and converting the CO2 to oxygen, right? And how much of this CO2 actually makes it out here? Can I actually emit 3,000 parts per million of CO2 here? And then, oh, these plants knock it down. And effectively what I want, if you think about this, right? To have a optimal system. Let me just do this real quick. You gotta give me a quick second. No, don't tell me you did that. Control Z. No, I didn't want to do that. I wanted to do it up here. Okay, to have an optimal system, and so beer can actually save the world. You want to have 410 parts per million of CO2 all along the perimeter of the greenhouse, because that's what the atmosphere holds, right? What this would mean would be that any CO2 that you put into the greenhouse through the connection, this let's say this is where the CO2 was being dispersed, it would be consumed, and by the time you got to the edges, it would be 410, which was equivalent to what atmospheric was. This would be the ideal, right? In the real world, I think what's going to happen is you're going to get different readings. And that's why I'm saying I would want 10 of these CO2 sensors. Now, can they all be run from one Raspberry Pi, or do I need multiple Arduino Unos or Megas, or, I have to play with that to set this thing up, right? And this is part of why I'm asking or, requesting crowdfunding for this, because as I do this, you'll see this costs real money, okay? So if we go to the web real quick, and I'm going to pull up a new tab, and we'll go to Amazon. We'll just go search Amazon. We'll go search Amazon's website for Raspberry Pi, right? Raspberry Pis. And if we just look through here at the price of a Raspberry Pi, you can see it's $100. That had some stuff that came with it, right? Here's just a core Raspberry Pi by itself, $47. But here's one with a case and some stuff, a cooling fan, some cabling. It's $84. 114 with some stuff, right? 64. Looks like, yeah, it's a basic kit, 64. We're going to call the Raspberry Pi about $100, okay? I'm going to round it to $100 because for $100, you can get the kit, you can get the power supply, you can get some coolers, you can get a case, so this thing could be installed out, in the greenhouse somewhere, and it would be functional, right? For the Raspberry Pi. Now, if we go with a Arduino Uno or Arduino Mega, because I don't think I would go with the Uno because they're the same thing except the Mega has a lot of stuff. So $28 for the Arduino Mega and 73, 35, 50, 60 here with a kit. You get a bunch of stuff to kind of play with and test, and that's kind of what I would want to get. So 60 for the Mega, right? We'll call it. Looks like if you just get the core board, it's as cheap as $18, right? So the price on that varies substantially. And then lastly, I got to get one of those two, right? And I'm going to say the Raspberry Pi, I got to get one of those anyway because I want to take this information and upload it to the web to a blockchain of a cryptocurrency. And let me make sure my volume's still working again because I switched. Let me check this real quick. Yes, it is. Okay, good. I'm so paranoid because I've never had the audio not work before. But if I come in here now and I look at my wish list, it's in the shopping cart. So if I go to my shopping cart, what you're going to see is this CO2 sensor, carbon dioxide sensor. It goes from 0 to 5,000 parts per million. They're $30 each. And if I do 10 of these, that's $300, right? So I do 10 of these, that's $300. And then you do a Raspberry Pi on top of that, that's another $100. So that's $400. By the time you're done with the cabling and the wire and blah, 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 you're at $500 probably, right? So it gets pretty expensive. And this is one of the reasons I'm asking for crowdfunding support, because I'm going to be doing this not just for the entertainment value for myself, but I'm going to be doing this for the education of the community as well. So all of this information is going to become public, right? So when I build these sensors, I have these CO2 sensors built, and I got 10 of them, and I think 10 is the right number to actually be able to model, if you will, and understand the flow of the carbon dioxide throughout the greenhouse. And obviously you're going to have blowers in here and stuff like this too, potentially, right? But with the blower off, how does the CO2 disperse? How much CO2 can be consumed by plants? If I put 4,000 ppm here, and I say this sincerely, if this is 4,000, do the plants around here die, right? Is 4,000 literally too high? Is 6,000 too high, right? I don't know that answer. I haven't seen anything on the web that talks about this, right? So 1,500, the one guy says, is optimal, but what he's talking about is an evenly distributed 1,500 everywhere, right? Now, can you get 1,500 distributed everywhere? How would you do that? You'd have to have blowers blowing, circulating, and you know what I mean? With pretty high velocities and stuff, right? Which I don't think is that practical. Excuse me while I take a sip of my homebrew. I don't think it's that practical, and I think more practically what's going to happen is you put out like 2,500 here, and then how does that 2,500 disperse? And what dispersion do you put here to try to get 410 around the edges, right? Because what happens is as the CO2 is emitted, it's going to be consumed as it flows outwards. So, okay. With that said, we'll go back to the calculator real quick, I think. And if you want this calculator, let me know and I will try to publish it. But you see what happens here is with my greenhouse, let me make sure, yep, this is my greenhouse. If I brew 25 gallons of beer, which my beer Borghini can handle, is 25 gallons is the max. And I did a 1.055, so I'd say a traditional light beer. I would be generating 4,482 parts per million of CO2 equivalent. That'd be the equivalent concentration in the greenhouse. Now, I'm curious what happens. And what would really be interesting to me is tracking the distribution of this amount of CO2 throughout the greenhouse. What does it look like? Do you have to circulate it with blowers and fans and stuff like that in order to, get it evenly spread throughout the warehouse or greenhouse? Or can you emit it in one spot and that the plants will consume it? And, it's a very interesting problem, right? So it was really fun creating this calculator. The reason I created this calculator came back to the question again that I asked myself was when I come to the process of brewing beer is, mash, yep. I didn't copy the block. But when it comes to the process of brewing beer is the CO2 that's emitted is the new brown dough for plants, right? CO2 is the new brown dough. And the plants say yummy, but how much do they say yummy to? If you got 1,500, is that the maximum yummy? Or is it actually less than 1,500? I read one article that said 1,200, okay? So, and then the other article says, but you can go up to 2,000, but if you go up to 2,000, you have to provide supplemental lighting, and you have to provide, you have to increase the temperature of the greenhouse, et cetera, et cetera. So the point is that brewing beer will save the world because it's going to increase the efficiency. It's going to increase the crop yields, right, of what we're calling urban, I'm going to call it urban cryptoponics. I'm not going to call it aquaponics because my system is much more than aquaponics, and we'll as we go on we'll discover all of the ways, right, of how CryptoPonics is the way to actually do it. But the question I had to ask when I went through this stuff yesterday was, what's the if I don't brew anything, I don't generate any CO2, right? And if I brew 1,000,000 gallons, every 5 days, that gives me another amount of CO2, right? Now, would that be wasteful? Would that be so much CO2 it's going to kill the plants? Would it be? I don't know those answers. And I found one article that talks about 1,500 is the best point. I found another article that talked about 1,200 is the best point. That first article talked about 2,000 is a good point if you're going to supplement your lighting and your temperature. The other article with the 1,200 didn't say any of that. I think you can do 1,500 parts per million in the entire greenhouse if you are without supplementing light or temperature. Do 1,500. So this will all be detectable, okay, and it will be entered into the blockchain for everybody to benefit from. And I could do everything from a 5-gallon batch would be the minimum I would want to do, but I could do smaller than that if need be, all the way up to a 25-gallon batch. So I got a 30-gallon cone bottom tank, but you wouldn't want to do a 30-gallon batch. You would want to do a 25-gallon batch in there in the beer Borghini, okay? If you're wondering about the beer Borghini, look at the previous videos. I covered the design of this. I refined it a little bit today more, and I was playing with some stuff, doing additional calculations for the beer Borghini. Now I can also ferment a batch in the beer Borghini Junior. I could do a 5-gallon batch in here. So that could do 5-gallon batch, and up here you could do as big as 25 gallons. Okay? So this all comes down from the discussion yesterday about CO2 generation and the new Brando and how much CO2 is the right amount of CO2, right? So with that said, let's take a quick look. I wanted to show one other thing here briefly, and then we're going to be getting off and wrapping this episode up. So I created this really cool calculator. I had fun with it. I'm going to do another goal seek just to get it back. So if I want 1,200 parts per million alt TG, 1,200 parts per million, set that to 1,200 by changing the batch size of the beer, because that generates the... So 4.85 gallons of beer, so a 5-gallon batch of beer generates 1,200 parts per million for my greenhouse, and that'll increase my crop yield by 30%, which, I mean, that would be phenomenal. If I brew 5 gallons of beer every 5 days, now I can't do that under Texas law. I can do 200 gallons a year, so I can do plus 200 divided by 52 gallons, 52 weeks. I could brew 3.84 gallons of beer per week in the state of Texas, right? So if I had another person here brewing beer as well, that's from a different household. That's the caveat to it. We could obviously increase and test that amount. So I'm going to have to watch the law on that one and be careful, okay? So that's a 30% yield. Now, if I want to increase my crop growth again, I set that to 1,500 by increasing my batch size. 6.7 gallons of beer per 5 days gets me 1,500 ppm, 36% vegetable yield increase, and 49.7 is my micro gallons of beer per day per gallon of greenhouse. And we've shown that that's the optimal design parameter for CO2 generation for increased vegetable growth. Okay? Now, you ask, how is all this data going to be handled, right? And that's where CryptoPonics comes in. A while back, I was playing with this on the first version of the video I made, but a while back I created a tab called condition codes. So when I think about putting information in the blockchain, it has to be put into the blockchain in a structured manner, right? So when I say structured manner is I have to create a JSON file, and I typed this in last episode, JSON. So that's a structured file format that everybody knows how to deal with, that knows how to program and web programming. So what I want to do in this JSON file is I want to define codes. Okay, I'm going to define codes, and then I'm going to define lists, and I'm going to define values. Okay, it's going to have a list or a value. Okay, or I guess it could have a list and a value, right? But there's going to be 3 pieces to the JSON file: a code, a list, and a value. Now the list, if it's blank, it doesn't have one, and if the value is blank, it doesn't have one, right? So every time that I update the blockchain of a cryptocurrency, I plan on updating with these things, and I've been working on these things, trying to update them. Okay. Now I remember this now. This is chelated iron. You have to forgive me. Okay, so as I've been doing things, I kind of, in my mind, I pop in, it's like, oh, I got to track that. Because what information do I want to track? So fish identification. So the code would be fish. And this is on a previous episode, I showed you how I've created a base 96 system. And with 2 digits or 3 digits, I could track anywhere from 10,000 fish up to almost 1 million fish, okay? Each fish is going to have a unique fish ID, okay? That's an important thing to understand. So when it goes in the blockchain, every fish will have a unique fish ID that no other fish will ever have, okay? Now, common name I thought about for like a reward for supporters. So if somebody supports CryptoPonics financially or donating time or whatever, we're going to name fish after them, right? One or more fish, but depends on how big their donation is, right? So it's a reward that we can give, and it'll be an alphabetic name after the supporter, and it's going to have a value up to 2 raised to the 6th characters, which is 64 characters. So we're going to allow 64 characters. So it'll be like name, then nothing, and then 64 characters for the name of the supporter. That's actually the fish name, okay? Then how lists work is you see like here, health, the code will be HLTH. And the health of the fish will have a code of 00 if it doesn't have an illness. It'll have 01 if it's potentially ill, that we're not sure, but it might be ill. And then 02 is illness is evident. So based on the health of the fish, it'll have a health code. So it'll be HLTH, and it'll be 00 if it's a healthy fish, right? And then that'll be in the JSON file. It'll be HLTH02 if it's sick, right? And 01 is, you looked at it, you're not quite sure, it might be sick, it might not be sick, right? Vitality status, similarly, you could say, well, what are the codes for that? And you could see we got 00 if the fish is alive, 01 if it's been harvested, 02 is unknown reason. Not even sure what that means. Oh, it died for an unknown reason. Maybe I should put the word died in there. Died for unknown reason. 03 was died to local wildlife. Died out of tank. Died from a mechanical breakdown. So we'll have codes in here, 2 digits, so you can have up to 99 vitality statuses of, is the fish alive, has it been harvested, or did it die for some reason, or we might even come up with other vitality statuses that I haven't even thought about yet, right? So feeding amount, every time it gets fed, we're going to put in the grams to 0 decimal value. So if it got fed, 125 grams was the feeding for, and I say that, I don't know what the numbers will be because I've done a preliminary calculation, but whatever amount it got fed on that feeding, I say this, I don't think the feedings are I'll have to change it. But anyway, so grams, and it might be to 0 decimal values. I'm going to put the X decimal values because I'm not sure it's going to be 0 decimal values. I might put the last digit is the decimal value, and if it's 0, it'll be 0. If it's 0.2 grams, you know what I mean? It'll have just a 2, not without the point. So feeding amount is how much did it get fed. And all of these are date stamped in the blockchain. So when the information gets entered into the blockchain, that is the date stamp of the information, right? So the weight of the fish, if the fish has been weighed, what's the weight to X decimal values, right? Length of the fish, now this is, I'm pretty certain, is millimeters. If we're measuring it to millimeters, we're definitely not going to be able to measure to a decimal value of millimeters. The age of the fish, I said, well, 3 digits with the first 2 digits representing the age in weeks of the fish with the last number equaling the days. So if you had most of these fish should be like 36 weeks and maybe 2 days, right? So 362 would be 36 weeks of age and 2 days when it gets harvested, for example, right? So that's how that would be represented. If you had a fish that was alive for, you know, each fish is going to have a birth date, right? That'll be tracked. So you might have a fish that's died at 12 weeks and 6 days, something like that, and it died. So you'd have a code in here, died for unknown reason, right? It would be tick 02. 2 would be there, and so it died of unknown reasons, and it was 12 weeks, 6 days when it died. Okay? So that's how I plan on using that one for age. Here, when I did the last episode, I was like, oh, because the tilapia can form hybrids, and if it's a hybrid fish, what type of hybrid is it, okay? So there's a thing called I think it's called a Florida red tilapia, and there's different types of hybrids. That'll go into this field. What color was the tilapia? That'll go in this field. Where's the location of the tilapia? So 00 Belenium. Belenium is bathhouse, if you remember. That's Latin for bathhouse, which is where the Romans used to, you know, heal. They used to cure themselves. They would go to bathhouse to disinfect and cleanse and purify, right? Well, that's what my Belenium is. It's a bathhouse. So that's for sick fish. They go to the Belenium, they get cured, right? 01 is the smallest area of the fish tank. 02 is the next bigger. 03 is the next bigger. And 04 is the final grow out section of the fish tank. And then 05 is the Piscina de Obitus. So that is the tank of death. It's the cleaning tank. It's the clean out tank. It's the tank where they swim for 7 days in clean water without recirculated gunk. And it cleans their systems out before we harvest them for meat, right? So that's kind of cool. Now, the next parameter I plan on tracking is the temperature of the water. And if you come down here, you can see I'm kind of playing with I'm not playing with temperature of the water, I'm playing with other temperatures. But this is going to be the temperature of the water, the code, and it'll obviously, I have to develop this more fully. You got the temperature ambient, humidity ambient. And down here I was like, oh, well, we need to have CO2 of the greenhouse parts per million. And if I had 10 sensors, my original thought was to have 10 sensors like this that we would track the parts per million for each one of them. But I think what I'm going to have is like parts per million. So what I think I'm going to have is XX. Let me put this in the. Let me put it here. XX, Y, 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 Y. So that would, the X is where XX is location ID and Y, 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 Y equal parts per million preceded with zeros if needed. So I think that's going to be a much more effective way to do this. Let me move this up. CO2 measurement. Read CO2 measurement. Yeah, this is how I want to do this. I think I'm glad I'm kind of doing this now. You got to do it while you remember it, otherwise you'll forget it and you'll never remember it again. CO2 measurement XXYYY, where XX is the location ID. So you could have 99 CO2 monitoring locations, right? CO2 sensing locations. And YYYY is the parts per million. So that allowed me to do 9,999 parts per million, right? Preceded with 0. So if your parts per million was 450, you'd have 0450, and that would get you 450, right? So this can go back like this. CO2 P, right? CO2 parts per million, we'll say that is, right? And then temperature is, I was going to do the same thing, TMP, temperature greenhouse. So we'll do the same thing there. And we'll do the same thing here, right? humidity greenhouse, right? So instead of having all of these things in the, now each one of the sensors, if you got 20 sensors, you'll generate 20 of these lines, right? So it's always important in my mind. Yep, you got to do that. Hold up. You got to do this. It's as much as I hate to do it, I got to do it, right? X, then I'll show you what I'm doing. Because when I program, I hate when I don't know the number of items in an array. Okay, so CO2 greenhouse, really? CO2 greenhouse, number of points, points. CO2, N for number, right? So that tells me, copy, boom, how many measurement points are there? So as you query, you could check that, right? So we'll do the same thing here, same thing here. TMPN and HUMN. Copy that, paste, paste. Change this to temperature. And change this next one to humidity. So what this does, it tells you how many points you're measuring. So if you're measuring 20 points, well, then you don't have to question. You can go 0 to 19 on it, right? So this was, what I plan on doing is measuring all of this information, entering it into the blockchain, and I'm not going to go through any more of these. You can see kind of what I'm doing, right? Location, where's the fish located, blah, 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 what's the temperature of the water. A lot of this information is going to be sampled by the Raspberry Pi / Arduino systems, and I'll have to figure out how all that works as far as how I'm going to integrate it, because some of the systems might have an Arduino, but then I want to feed that Arduino information to the Raspberry Pi for recording in the blockchain. So, because that's an important part to me to do here, right? So, pH, what's the pH of the water? What's the water level? I said, which water level? Is there multiple? I got to figure this out, right? If you're going to add chemicals to the water, so calcium carbonate, magnesium carbonate, how many grams of calcium carbonate were added to the system? And I'm not saying the mixture, I'm saying of actual calcium carbonate, right? I'll go like this, not water. So when you make up a solution, the solution might be circulating in a bucket. Well, when the computer goes to add it, if it's a 50-50 mixture by weight, for example, if it's 50-50 and the computer adds 100 grams of calcium carbonate, calculate that's how much it needed, this would be 50 grams, and it was going to put 50 in here, right? So that's really kind of cool. You're going to track all of this, right? Every time the blockchain gets updated. So, and I might, let me think. No, I'm going to do this for every fish too. So magnesium carbonate, chelated iron. So I don't know when you add this, but I've seen people talk about adding chelated iron to the aquaponics system that it's needed, right? Dissolved oxygen. I looked at dissolved oxygen systems, right? And the card that hooks up to the Raspberry Pi or to the Arduino, it's like $50 for the card. So I was like, oh, that's not that bad. But then the more I looked at it, it was like, oh, it doesn't have a probe. The probe is like $200 or $300. It's expensive, okay? And what I want to do again is integrate this to the, to the Raspberry Pi, and then have that integrated to the web, to the blockchain, so then you can query the blockchain and get all this data. I think a little program or utility will have to be developed, but I think that's easy enough as well. Dissolved solids. We talked about all this stuff. And then I'm going to have to put some stuff in here about brewing. Am I emitting CO2? Am I not emitting CO2? You know what I'm saying? I might want to measure the amount of CO2 I'm emitting as I'm emitting it. So my thought is for every, let's say I take and I weigh 20 fish. Because I'm not going to weigh every fish every time, right? So throughout the life cycle of the fish, I'm going to take a net and I'm going to net a fish. I'm going to look at his ID tag. I'm going to weigh him, and I kind of have some ideas on the weighing system. And then that information will get entered into the blockchain, right? So that's going to be a manual. I'm going to queue it into a manual interface, and then the next time that the system cycles information, it'll include that information for that fish into the blockchain, right? Now, things like water temperature and what location the fish is in and ambient temperature and the humidity ambient and, all of this stuff will be automatically included because it's going to be data collected by the Raspberry Pi / Arduino. So anyway, the condition codes are a way to log everything into a JSON file. That JSON file hopefully will be pushed to the web and loaded into the blockchain of a cryptocurrency that you can then, it'll be the recording, it'll be the recording of the fish, right? Now, how often do I update? I'll have to figure all that out, right? So this all started from a simple discussion yesterday about CO2 and how's beer going to save the world? Well, beer is going to save the world because beer is going to increase the crop yields of urban aquaponics, urban cryptoponics, okay? So the CO2 generated from brewing beer is going to increase the yields, which as the world's population grows, we're going to create more and more of these urban cryptoponic gardens. And by increasing the efficiency, by brewing beer, which increases the efficiency of the greenhouse vegetables, we are going to increase the our food stores, right? Which, based on my calculator, I've determined the appropriate design parameter is 49.7 microgallons of beer per day per gallon of greenhouse. So whenever you design your greenhouse, you can literally just use that value and calculate how much beer you should be brewing inside of that greenhouse to have the optimal value, okay? To have the optimal CO2, right? Because 1500 ppm is optimal. Once you go above that, if I go to 8 here, you see, boom, now I need supplemental lighting and I need to increase the temperature of my greenhouse. Now, I want to build this smart greenhouse, right? That has computer control and computer monitoring, right? And it's hooked up to the blockchain. I want to show everyone that that's the correct design parameters, because there seems to be a little bit dispute here anyway, right? So is 1500 ppm the right value without supplemental lighting? So at some point, I should probably buy some supplemental lighting and provide the supplemental lighting at 1500 ppm. Well, first off, I have to determine, the first thing I have to do, and this is where it gets really tricky, guys, is it's not as simple as we think, right? And that's why no one has done this. The first thing I have to do is determine if I'm pumping out 1500, no, not 1250. If I'm pumping out 1500 here, or I'm pumping out the equivalent, whatever I'm pumping out here, what does that look like on this map, right? Is it 410 around the edges with 1500 here? Is it with no fans blowing around? What does it look like with fans blowing around? Is it all uniform? How fast do the plants uptake this carbon dioxide? That's the other thing I really need to know, right? Is my calculator, let me look at the calculator. I probably want to, absolutely, it's not on here and I want to add that to my calculator. Hold up. That's what's so cool about talking through all this, is somewhere on here, I want to do carbon dioxide per hour, right? Or per minute. Because that's what this really, it's dependent upon on that. If you think about the CO2 that's coming out of that pipe, right? It's all about how fast it's coming out, right? So when I say it gives me an equivalent of 1500 ppm, that's during each day of fermentation, right? So the concept there is that I'm adding enough. I got the ambient CO2 of 410, and then I'm adding enough CO2 from brewing of the beer to get me to an equivalent of 1500 ppm per day, per each day of fermentation. Now, the assumption is that 1500 ppm is consumed during that day, right? And then the next day we're going to put in another 1500 ppm over a 24-hour period, right? So we're not putting in 1500 ppm. We're putting in enough CO2 to make the greenhouse have the equivalent of 1500 ppm, right? Now, how much CO2 is that per minute, right? How much CO2 is flowing through that pipe per minute? What's that value look like, right? Now, I videoed this for my beer brewing. You're saying with 6.69 gallons of beer, it becomes almost a continuous stream out of a small hose. It's like bloop, 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 bloop. CO2 bubbles are just popping out, okay? So what's the plants might actually take more than this. The plants might actually, this is what has to be determined. I mean, nobody knows this. It's a complicated process, right? The article I read talks about supplemental CO2, and it has sensors and generators, and I'm sure people know these values because they have greenhouses, but it's a difficult thing to find out, right? Now, I'm also talking about generating it from beer. So not only do we have fish and vegetables, we're going to have good, wholesome, delicious, pure beer that we can partake in. And when I talk about rewards, yeah. So I'll just show you what I've been looking at rewards. We're going to say beer for local. So some of the rewards we talked about that I've been thinking about, and again, I need help, guys. So if you watch this far, please consider helping me. Please consider donating some time to CryptoPonics. I don't care if it's just a little slice of time, but whatever time you can give me or give the project is beneficial time, right? So because stuff like this, what are the rewards we could offer for supporters, right? So name a fish and dish it to the base 96 name. I kind of taken care of that already. You could take home harvested fish. So if a person was local to Houston, they could stop by and take home fish as a reward, right? Take home harvested vegetables. That would be pretty cool, right? And I say vegetables, herbs, fruits, etc., right? Because they're gonna be, crypto, that's mine, right? If we get to the point where we do the crypto for CryptoPonics, which I hope we do, okay? I pray. Now, I looked at this before with people, and I'm not going to go through it in detail, but you see, Excavatio de Secretis is the mining rigs, okay? The mining rigs right now in my budget, this is my budget. Now, I haven't developed everything. I want to be clear again. This is not fully developed. Mining rigs are pretty close, though. That was pretty easy. $17,000 of mining rigs to provide crypto and heat and other things to the CryptoPonics, right? So that's a pretty big number. Solar, System Solare is $18,000. I got that from a website called solarestimate.org, solar panels for Houston, Texas, where I am. And it estimated that for 5 kilowatts, which is what I would need, that it was $18,000. So if you look at those two ticket items, they're $35.5 thousand. Now, I haven't developed the rest of this fully. The fish tank is fairly developed. It's not completely developed, but I've gone through for the fish tank and I identified all the pieces that I would need. Now, there's some stuff left to do here, so it's not complete yet. But based on that, I've come through, I've applied taxes, I got websites linked to, or it's in my shopping cart, or you know what I mean? So this is for the big fish tank that has the 4 pieces to it. And like I said, I got some more to do here. Once I finish this, then I'm going to do the rest of the tanks, right? So the 40 micrometer Piscina de Serenes. It's the tank of serenity, or a tank of calm. And it's a settling tank, okay? Which is really the radial flow filter kind of equivalent. So Piscina de Obitus, I said, was the clean out tank, or the tank of the death. The medical, the bathroom, the bathhouse, millennium. And some of this stuff, see, I have nothing developed yet. I have like this filtrare de rotundis. I've purchased some stuff already for this, but I don't have it in here, right? So I have to add stuff in here yet. It's the reason I have 40K on my GoFundMe as a number. Really, I got a lot to develop here. It'll probably approach 40K, but it'll be a little short, but we'll see. And then I also have to have a license to grow tilapia. And that license costs $263. It's the licentia. Licentia is the license in Latin. And I'm saying it with an Italian accent. I've been to Italy. I've actually spent several months on vacation in Italy, so I've been very fortunate, right? This is computer systems, and I can't remember what else. But anyway, I'm not going to go through all that, guys. But the rewards, I want, merch. So if we're mining crypto, we could sell some of that crypto and then use the sale of that crypto to buy merch for people, right, as a reward, right? And then beer could be a reward where, people come over and they partake with beer or whatever, right? So that could be another reward. And then I was like, well, what are the reward tiers, right? So these are the, let me come in here and move all this down some more. I started thinking about tiers of rewards. And you have one-time donations. So if somebody goes on and says, oh, I'm going to make a one-time donation of $20, right? Greatly appreciated, right? And so what would they get for that? What would they get rewarded for that $20 donation, right? What type of, and I think what I have to do is I have to sign points to this, right? Points and reward, right? And here we would say beer like, I don't know, 32 ounces, right? So 32 ounces of beer is maybe requires, I don't know, 5 points, we'll say, right? And 5 points, and then down here, if you donate $10, maybe it gets you 5 points, right? So I'm thinking something like this, right? And then over here I said, well, if it's a recurring donation, so if somebody does a monthly donation, so if they do a $2 monthly donation after 5, yeah, maybe I do like this, because this is what I was thinking. There's equivalents, right? Why did I stop here? Recurring donations of $10 for 5, but you'd probably want something more than that. So 2 times 25-ish, sort of, right? So after 2 donations, if you did a recurring donation of, yeah, I think so, right? So recurring donation of $10 times 2 times, then you get so many points for that, right? Yes. This makes much more sense to me. So, and I like doing it this way with while I'm streaming, because it actually lets you know organically what I'm thinking, right? So if you do $5 recurring donation, after 2 donations, you receive 5 points, okay? With those 5 points, you can literally get, if you're here local to Houston, you could get 32 ounces of beer, right? That's a quart of beer. Yeah, 12, 24, 36 is the equivalent of 3 beer cans. So that's too much, I think. So we'll say 12 ounces. Yeah, that would be more appropriate, right? And that's what I have to say. I need people to help me with this, right? I'm poking numbers in here. These are all adjustable, right? And eventually we're going to expose this. It'll be made public, right? And merch points. How many points does it take for merch? Because ultimately merch is like a dollar conversion, right? So with the beer, 12 ounces, I don't know. I have to go through this, right? So 100, we're going to say, see, when you start getting big like this, you got to say 4-time donations at 25. Or does it matter? Does it matter as long as you get the equivalent of what these dollars are, right? Whatever the math is required to get 20. So if you did 5 times 4, well, 5 times 2 gets you 10, right? That's the equivalent of $10. Whether you donate $10 or you do $5 2 times, it's the same donation to me, right? Or to us, to CryptoPonics. So it's the same donation. That's going to get you 5 points. 5 points can be used for 12 ounces of beer, right? I think so, yeah. And with like merch, if you donated here $50, let's say that gets you $25 worth of, that gets you 25 points, right? 5 to 10, so the points were half of that, right? So this would be 10 points. This would be 25 points. This would be 50 points. This would be 250 points. 2.5 points and 0.5 points, right? So this is pretty easy. And then so you earn points, and then you can, maybe you can donate your points or you can use your points. That'd be up to you, right? And so merch would be like, I'm thinking merch would be like 25 points for merch up to $25 value, right? So merch that's up to $25 value, you would use 25 points to do that, right? And to get 25 points, you would make a donation to get those points. And then those points can be used for stuff like this, right? Crypto. Now, crypto we would discount, I think, but, you know, take home harvested veggies, blah, blah. We'll have to put values to this, right? Take home harvested fish. I went to the grocery store the other day and tilapia was $6.99 per pound. So I've seen it as low frozen. I've seen it as low as $1.99 a pound, I think, frozen. But imagine if you're local here. Now, eventually, if this becomes, I'll have to check into how I can commercialize this, quote unquote. How can I ship fish? Can I freeze and ship fish to people? You know what I'm saying? I would love to do that. Whoa. So, let's do this real quick. I want to quickly do this. Take home harvested fish. Take home harvested veggies, right? I am going to smoked tilapia / cured tilapia / pickled tilapia. So I love to smoke fish. One of the things I was talking to my mother the other day with Christmas coming up, I love pickled herring. I absolutely love pickled herring, especially around the holidays. That's when my family traditionally ate it, right? Imagine that we created pickled tilapia. I mean, pickling stuff, it's cooking, right? And I could literally show the cooking of it, but that could be a reward here too, right? Smoked salmon, I love making smoked salmon, right? Now, I've thought a lot about tilapia and smoking fish. The fattier the fish, the better it is to smoke, typically, right? And tilapia is not a very fatty fish, but I've been thinking about the curing recipe for smoking tilapia, and I think what I would do is decrease the amount of salt and increase the ratio of salt to sugar and other ingredients, because you do put other ingredients. I put garlic in mine and I put onions in mine, and it really makes a delicious smoked fish. But I think what you would do is you would add less salt, which sucks the moisture out of the fish, right? And smoke it with a different ratio of ingredients. And I think you could smoke a leaner fish better that way. So that's going to be awesome to try as well, right? Now, what are the other things that you could do for merch or for rewards? You know what I'm saying? There's lots of things. And the other thing I have to do is I have to come in here and I have to say tiers, local volunteers, right? Local volunteers, 1 hour. What's 1 hour worth, right? So somebody that's local here, if they come volunteer to do something locally, what's that worth? As far as how many points, right? How many points do we get for doing that, right? So this is all the stuff I need help with, guys, and I'm really looking for volunteers to come on and help me do some of this stuff. I mean, it's really kind of brainstorming. It's doing stuff. It's setting up a merch store. The first piece of merch I want to do is the CO2, the new Brando, and I want a picture. I want a picture of a green, a little sprout. I want a picture of a fish, and I want a picture of something representing cryptocurrency. So. Anyway, so that's how beer is going to save the world. Let's recap one final time, and then we're going to wrap this up. How is beer going to save the world? Okay, as the world's population grows, there's going to be increasing pressure put on our food chain. Okay, our food supply. So as the right now I don't know how many is it. What's the current Earth's population? I better look that up. Current I thought it was like 7 billion or some crazy number. Current population of Earth, not Texas. 2019. 7.6. I'm rounding it off, okay? Woo. Oh, there's a cool website. What is this? This is a picture. Forgive me a second, guys. Anyway, it says 7.6 billion people, okay? So 7.6 billion people as the Earth's population grows, right? And I now that makes me want to get a little projection for what our population is going to do. But as the Earth's population grows, what's going to happen is there's going to be more and more pressure put on our food chain, right? The more pressure that's put on our food chain, the more important it is for us to find more effective ways to grow food, okay? We have to increase the efficiency of growing food. And one of the ways, this article, if you look at this article, which I disagree with, okay, I'll show you why I disagree with the article in a second. There's an article here. Let me show you the Earth's population real quick. Okay, I come here. So here's where it shows that 7.6 billion people are the current population of Earth. But in this article, he talks about how do you increase the CO2 in a greenhouse, right? And he says there are two good choices for efficiently increasing plant growth and carbon dioxide levels inside your garden, aka greenhouse, right? So I disagree with this statement here, and I hate to, Jason, I hate to disagree with you, but because it's a really good article, okay? But he says that there's two ways. I'm arguing there's one good way, and then there's two not so good ways, two additional not so good ways, okay? So the first good way to increase plant growth and carbon dioxide levels inside your greenhouse is to brew beer, okay? That's number one, but in my opinion, by far, okay? Because you're creating a product, you're creating carbon dioxide, and you are increasing the efficiency of your growth inside your greenhouse, right? And I'm going to determine how much more efficient it is, right? So that's number one. Then number two, he says, I'm saying the number two method is to use a CO2 generator. And the number three method is to use tanks of compressed CO2, okay? So there's not two good choices. There's one good choice and two not so good choices. So I disagree with him a little bit, right? Which we can get past. That's not insurmountable to overcome that disagreement. So how does beer save the world? We brew beer. The beer creates CO2. The 410 parts per million of CO2, we increase that value to 1,500 parts per million in our urban greenhouse. Now you got to remember, urban greenhouses are not, you don't have to clear jungles. You don't have to, they're small scale, they're local to where the food's being consumed, right? And there's lots of benefits of having this urban greenhouse, right? So people are growing their own good vegetables, right? So you brew beer, the beer creates CO2, the CO2 increases the yield of the greenhouse. The yield of the greenhouse is increased to the optimal value, so we're increasing the growth of our vegetables tremendously, and we're creating beer plus fish plus vegetables all at once. And think about that combination. You could be having a beer with your dinner, eating some delicious tilapia or having some smoked tilapia or pickled tilapia. I've never pickled tilapia. I've never pickled salmon. I've never pickled herring. I've eaten it, but I've never pickled it, right? And how delicious does that sound, having pickled tilapia? I mean, pickled herring is absolutely delicious. I have to imagine pickled herring, pickled tilapia. I'm actually going to do some pickled tilapia as a video test for this, process, right? So anyway, guys, thank you for joining me for this lengthy, wandering, meandering, mind-provoking journey we went on, right? My videos are not concise. They're not like to the point. It's a journey that we undertake. And while we undertake that journey, we branch off left and right whenever we see things that are intriguing to us. And like I said yesterday, literally, so I spent a lot of time today doing this and researching this and making the video. And this is my second time making the video, all because when I did the presentation yesterday, I talked about mashing beer, I talked about lautering beer, I talked about sparging the beer, I talked about cooling the beer, I talked about fermentation and how fermentation releases the new Brando, which is CO2, because plants say yummy, yum, yum, yum. They love Brando, right? So with that, guys, again, I ask for your help. Smash that sub, like, share button. That's the first thing you can do is sub, like, share the video, right? And first and foremost, that's the easiest thing you can do to help promote CryptoPonics. I want to make this is going to cost a lot of money. We just looked at, what was this, $400 or $500 for the CO2 monitoring? Just the CO2 monitoring is $400 or $500. The probe for the dissolved solids in the water was $300, right? And those are all computer based. So all that information is getting it loaded into the blockchain. You're going to have access to it. You'll be able to pull up this blockchain and access that data. So if you ever have a question like, well, what's the best temperature to run my greenhouse at? What's the best, with a certain CO2 level? Because I'll bet money that it changes, right? Versus, that's another instrument I need. Oh, it never ends. Hold up. I got to enter these instruments because I want an instrument. Hold up. Parts list, condition codes. I want to record sunlight per day. So effective sunlight, because you could look at we could calculate, well, I'm going to get so many hours of sunlight for this location, but the location of your greenhouse and it all changes on an individual basis, right? Like I know the one I'm building, it doesn't have the optimal amount of sunlight because it's not in the middle of an open field, right? So sunlight per day is going to be an important parameter for me to measure as well, right? So, and I live in Houston, so we get more sun than other places, right? So that's another important parameter to start tracking for educational purposes, right? So with that said, guys, this is an experiment. This is an educational adventure we're taking. This is not going to be, don't be expecting like really concise, short and to the point videos, because that's not who I am. I'm much more of a free thinker. I'm much more of a meanderer. I like to meander. I like to, and that's how I come up with ideas, right? So first and foremost, like I said, sub, like, share the video if you can. That really will help us out. Right now we have 1 subscriber to the channel. We got our first subscriber. I was so happy to see that. The channel's been up a few days. We don't even have we don't have social media set up. We don't have Kickstarter. We don't have Indiegogo. We don't have, there's lots of stuff we don't have, right? If you could do graphic arts type stuff, I actually know who can do that. I got to get in contact with her. see if she could do some graphic arts for me, right? But we need graphic arts done. We need, eventually I want to get a website. I want to turn this into not a full-time job, but, something that is rewarding and something that is significant for the community, right? Because as we get support, we want to show the value for that support. And two things that the support does, it's going to provide for the CryptoPonics vision, which I haven't laid out fully for everybody yet. So you don't even know what the vision is, right? I'm asking for support before the vision's finished. And what I'm telling you is there is a vision, and it's going to become clear over time, and it will be unveiled over little videos like this one, okay? So with that said, guys, thank you so much for your time. Anything you can do to help CryptoPonics is greatly appreciated. And with that, I'm going to sign off. We'll see you guys later.